This is The Decline and Fall of Practically Everybody by Will Cuppy. Today I'm going to be reading through the second chapter, Hatshepsut. In the 18th dynasty, Egypt was ruled by Queen Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, and every so often Hatshepsut would catch Thutmose III right behind the ear with a piece of rock. You can hardly blame her. For all her life she had been completely surrounded by Thutmoses, a family of ugly little pharaohs with retreating foreheads, bulging eyes, and projecting front teeth, and it was getting on her nerves. She was suffering from an advanced stage of Thutmose trouble, a condition in which you see one or more Thutmoses every direction you look. It became second nature to throw something whenever she saw one, real or imaginary. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, and had helped him govern Egypt when she was a mere girl. He was too lazy and shiftless to do it alone. Then she had married her half-brother, Thutmose II, to strengthen his position on the throne, as she was of royal blood on both sides, and he wasn't. Thutmose II was the son of Thutmose I and some outsider, a fact to which Hatshepsut doubtless called his attention from time to time. She wanted to be the boss, whether anyone loved her or not. Some people are like that. He was a frail, effeminate youth with a blotchy complexion, the weakest of all the Thutmoses, but Hatshepsut was the managing kind, and they had two daughters, Neferuri and Meritire. Thutmose II died in 1501 BC, leaving Hatshepsut face to face with Thutmose III, 9-year-old son by one of his concubines. Modern research shows that the shoulders, hips, pelvis, and breastbone of Thutmose II had been broken. His nose was deformed too, as if somebody had let a flat iron slip, and there were symptoms of rat poison. Egyptologists have no idea who did any of this. Egyptologists who examined the mummy of Thutmose II almost 3,500 years after his death said that he was not a well man. He looked awful. So there she was with another one on her hands. Thutmose III was easily the ugliest of the lot, with almost no forehead at all and a nasty habit of talking back. His skull was pentagonoid in shape. His face was small, narrow, elliptical, and hopeless. The back of his head was perfectly flat. He's now in the Cairo Museum. As she was the only surviving child of Ahmose, the great royal wife of Thutmose I, Wahmose and Amenose had died in infancy, so had Neferupati. Hatshepsut had to act as regent and do all the work and during the minority of her young nephew and stepson, and the arrangement proved a little difficult on both sides. She even married her daughter Neferuri to Thutmose III for the good of the family, thus becoming his mother-in-law, as well as his stepmother and Aunt Hattie. It didn't seem to work out somehow. When this had gone on for 6 or 7 years, Hatshepsut decided to take steps. After all, she was legitimate, and she was sick and tired of stooging for these sons of concubines without receiving equal honors. She thought it over and decided that if some people could be pharaohs, she would be one herself, instead of stepping down when Thutmose III came of age. There was, however, an unbreakable tradition that only a king could rule in Egypt, so she was not eligible for the job. For her handling of this situation, Hatshepsut has been called the first great woman of history. She simply appointed herself king of Egypt, and that was all there was to it. To show her subjects she was properly qualified, Hatshepsut set up many statues and portraits of herself, representing herself as a regular male pharaoh with a beard. Pharaohs wore artificial beards, symbolic of artificial wisdom. This fooled nobody, but it was legal proof because she was the law, and she was the law because she said she was. Hatshepsut was quite a surprise to the Egyptians, who had gone along thinking it's man's world. It is, with certain exceptions. Hatshepsut allowed Thutmose III to keep his title of pharaoh and act as junior co-ruler. That is, she would let him burn incense in her honor, feed her herd of pet cows, run errands, and have his name on the monuments after her own in smaller hieroglyphics. He wanted to be a soldier and fight the Mesopotamians in Asia like Ahmose I and Thutmose I, but whenever he mentioned it, she would hit him again. Hatshepsut was a firm believer in peace outside the home. When they started to argue, something was bound to give, and it wasn't Hatshepsut. Although she let the army go to sea, the fact is that as long as she lived, the Nubians were as quiet as mice, and the Mesopotamians never revolted, not even once. They had probably heard about her. Hatshepsut had her tender side, as who hasn't? Her name has been rather bandied about in connection with Senmut, a handsome architect of humble birth whose plans and specifications she much admired. She had seen him first while her husband, Thutmose II, was still alive, and made a memo in case she ever wanted any new architecture. When and where they meet is uncertain, but one evening shortly after the funeral, they were noticed loitering around in the sacred sycamore grove as if they had some important buildings in mind. And the next morning, Senmut was appointed chief of the royal works. From then on, Hatshepsut and Senmut were in conference almost every day, for she needed more and more architecture all the time. Senmut would come to the palace each morning to show her his blueprints, and in the evening they would check up with a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. Eventually, Senmut became the most powerful man in Egypt, with more titles and wealth than he could use, gained by his own individual talents. Hatshepsut's prime minister was Hapu-seneb, a bald-headed old fellow with a wen on the end of his nose. He died poor. Senmut was a born architect, as he proved while building a temple which Hatshepsut founded at Deir el-Bahri, across the river from Thebes, in honor of herself and the sun god Ammon. After 7 years, still incomplete, the temple was 3 times as large as he said it would be, had cost 8 or 9 times as much as he figured, and bore no resemblance to the original plans except that it was a temple. He never did get it finished. He also raised at Karnak 2 pink granite obelisks, one of which did not fall down, though it was always slightly askew. Hatshepsut was very religious, and covered the walls with pictures of herself and hieroglyphics saying that she was the daughter of the god Ammon, and he had crowned her in person, giving her a much better right to the throne than Thutmose III. When she thought up another one, she'd put that on the wall too. Part of the time, Hatshepsut and Thutmose would build ruined temples in Thebes, but mostly they stuck to obelisks. Hatshepsut would put up 2 obelisks covered with pictures of Egyptians going both ways at once, and other hieroglyphics telling how good she was. The next day, Thutmose would rush out and put up 2 taller obelisks telling how good he was, and this went on until neither one of them could think up any more lies. For a general notion of Hatshepsut's appearance at a certain stage of her career, we are indebted to one of those wall inscriptions. It states that to look upon her was more beautiful than anything. Her splendor and her form were divine. Some have thought it odd that the female pharaoh should have been so bold, 50-ish as she was. Not at all. She was just saying how things had been about 35 years back, before she'd married Thutmose II and slugged it out with Thutmose III. She was a maiden, beautiful and blooming, the hieroglyphics run, and we have no reason to doubt it. Surely there's no harm in telling the world how one looked in 1514 BC. Whatever the records may hint about Hatshepsut and her friend, they accomplished plenty of solid constructive work, and the rest is only hearsay. You know how people talk. Titles like Chief of the Works, Superintendent of the Royal Bedroom, and Steward of the Private Apartments are easily misunderstood, as are gifts of land and gold running into the millions and prolonged conversations into the small hours, all of which may have been Hatshepsut's method of handling a business connection necessary in the success of her career. Really good architects are hard to get. One of the main events of Hatshepsut's reign was the voyage to Punt, or Somaliland, for things to use in temple services and in the terraced gardens of Ammon. 5 small vessels went down the Red Sea in 1492 BC and returned with 31 living myrrh trees, many other varieties of odoriferous and ornamental plants. Like so many great women, Hatshepsut was a garden fanatic, always asking for slips. They brought back myrrh resin, ifmut incense, cinnamon wood, kisset wood, made from the kisset tree, ebony, ivory, gold, electrum, more than 300 animals, including greyhounds, monkeys, and a giraffe, some puntites, and a collection of native throw sticks, and several unidentifiable objects. Senwut did not go to Punt. The Punt adventure is generally regarded as an important advance in Egyptian bottomry. The truth is that bottomry has been going on in a quiet way since the beginning of Egyptian history. Trips down the Red Sea were getting to be routine as early as the 5th dynasty, with Punt as a regular stop. In the 6th dynasty, an official named Khnumhotep went to Punt 11 times for myrrh and stuff and made no fuss about it whatsoever. But you know Hatshepsut. She covered a whole wall with pictorial account of the expedition and how it was the biggest thing ever, thanks to a certain party. Hatshepsut died in 1479 BC at the age of 59 or so, having reigned 21 years and 9 months, figuring from the death of her husband Thutmose II. Nobody can prove that Thutmose III murdered his Aunt Hattie or even harmed her in the least. We do know, however, that she'd kept him sitting in the corner biting his nails all that time, and he should have been the whole ruler of Egypt, and it looked like another 20 years before of the same, unless something drastic happened. But what would you have done? A friend suggests that when Hatshepsut heard of the birth of Thutmose IV, she just gave up. An enchanting theory, but the dates were against it. Guilty or innocent, Thutmose III did not behave as one should when one's aunt, stepmother, and mother-in-law has passed away. First he went on a spree for 2 months, or some say 3. Then he chopped the noses off all Hatshepsut's statues and dumped them in a deep quarry, chiseled her face and name off the records, and walled up her best obelisk so that posterity should never know she had existed, let alone read her hieroglyphics about what a wonderful woman she was. You can't do that, of course. Some of those very statues, dug up and nicely repaired, may be seen today at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. One of Senwut's statues is in Chicago. Another, now at Cairo, was discovered by 2 English ladies, Miss Benson and Miss Gourley, of all people, while poking around the Temple of Mut. And the masonry fell away from the obelisk, leaving it in splendid condition with its hieroglyphics undamaged by the centuries and easy for us to decipher as the result of Thutmose's dirty trick. So she had the last word after all, which doesn't surprise me a bit. But guess what this frustrated little fellow did next after he ran out of noses to smash? He went to Asia with his army and killed the natives to his heart's content, and stole so much of their goods that Egypt was rolling in wealth for quite a while. But finally the money gave out. No one knows where it went. Thutmose III was one of the earliest exponents of internationalism, or going into other countries and slaughtering the inhabitants. He made 17 campaigns into Asia, and then took it easy for the last 12 years of his life, erecting obelisks of his own, writing his memoirs on the walls, murdering a few Nubians to keep in practice, and helping to bring up his little grandson, Thutmose IV. For these activities, many scholars regard him as the greatest of the pharaohs. You'll find him on every list of really important people. Thutmose III died in 1447 BC, in the 54th year of his reign, or the 32nd, counting from the death of Hatshepsut. None of his obelisks, inscribed with whopping big lies about his 17 campaigns, remained in Egypt. They were picked up as souvenirs and carried to distant lands. One of them is known as Cleopatra's Needle, although it had nothing to do with Cleopatra and never had. It is called Cleopatra's Needle because the world is full of people who think up these things. If you ask me, it always will be. It is now in Central Park, New York City, where it causes passersby to pause for a moment in the day's rush and inquire, what the hell is that?